His throne was a house of lies. Serafina Mancini had spent a decade playing the role of the perfect mafia wife. But when her husband was assassinated, when the men who once bowed to him turned their attention to her, she realized she had two choices: kneel or fight. The only man who saw her as more than a pawn was Luca Romano, her husband's most trusted enforcer. "Tell me, Regina," he murmured, stepping closer. "Are you here to mourn him, or take his throne?" Chapter 1. The shadow of loss falls upon the estate. The black limousine snaked its way through the wrought iron gates, the gravel crunching under its tires a stark counterpoint to the silence that had settled over the Mancini estate. Serafina sat rigidly in the back, her black veil obscuring the world, but not the hollow ache in her chest. 10 years. 10 years she had been Signora Mancini, wife of Antonio, the capo of the Mancini family. 10 years of playing the part, of smiling when she wanted to scream, of nodding when she wanted to argue, of burying her own desires beneath the weight of tradition and expectation. The car stopped before the imposing villa, its gray stone facade seeming to weep in the soft drizzle that had begun to fall. The air, thick with the scent of wet earth and impending grief, felt heavy on her lungs. Alessandro, Antonio's aging but ever-vigilant driver, opened the door, his weathered face etched with a sorrow that mirrored, yet couldn't possibly match, her own. "Signora," he said, his voice hoarse, extending a gloved hand. Serafina took it, the leather smooth against her own trembling fingers. She stepped out, her black dress whispering against the cobblestones. The villa, usually a hive of activity, was eerily quiet. No boisterous laughter from the men gathered in the courtyard, no clatter of dishes from the kitchen, no scent of Maria's rich tomato sauce simmering on the stove. Only the hushed murmurs of the few family members who had already arrived, their faces grim, their eyes darting towards her with a mixture of pity and something else. Curiosity? Suspicion? She walked towards the entrance, her back straight, her head held high. It was a performance, one she had perfected over the years. The grieving widow, the dutiful wife. But inside, the carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Antonio was gone. Shot in broad daylight, a brazen attack that had sent shockwaves through the city's underworld. And with his death, the precarious balance of power had shifted. The grand foyer was dimly lit, the heavy oak doors casting long shadows across the marble floor. A few flickering candles on a nearby table cast a macabre glow, illuminating the somber faces of her in-laws. There was old Donatello, Antonio's uncle, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and regrets, clutching his rosary beads. Isabella, Antonio's sister, her sharp eyes narrowed, her usual flamboyant attire replaced by a severe black dress. And then there was Marco, Antonio's younger brother, his handsome face marred by a barely concealed ambition. "Serafina," Donatello said, his voice raspy with age and grief. He shuffled towards her, his hand outstretched. "My dear, such a tragedy. Such a loss." She took his hand, the papery skin surprisingly warm. "Thank you, Donatello." Her voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil within. Isabella stepped forward, her embrace stiff and formal. "You have our deepest condolences, Serafina." The words were polite, but the underlying tone was cold. Marco, however, held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. His eyes, usually alight with mischief, were dark and unreadable. "Serafina," he murmured, his voice low and intimate. "We will find who did this. We will avenge him." The words sent a shiver down her spine. Avenge him. The endless cycle of violence, of blood for blood. It was the Mafia way, the code they lived and died by. But for the first time, Serafina questioned it. What good would more death bring? She pulled away from Marco, her gaze sweeping the room. Where was Luca? Luca Romano, Antonio's most trusted enforcer, the man who had been by his side for years, the man who had always looked at Serafina with a mixture of respect and something else. Something she had never dared to acknowledge, to even consider. As if summoned by her thoughts, the heavy front doors swung open, and Luca strode in, his presence filling the room. He was a formidable figure, tall and powerfully built, His dark hair slicked back, his jaw set in a grim line. His eyes, the color of dark chocolate, scanned the room, finally settling on Serafina. He walked towards her, his steps silent on the marble floor. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze intense, searching. "Signora," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I am sorry." The sincerity in his voice, the raw emotion in his eyes, almost broke her. For a moment, the mask slipped, and she felt the tears welling up, threatening to spill over. But she fought them back, forcing herself to remain composed. "Thank you, Luca," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his gaze lingering on hers. There was a question in his eyes, an unspoken inquiry. He was assessing her, she realized, trying to gauge her strength, her resolve. He stepped slightly closer, lowering his voice so that only she could hear. "Tell me, Regina," he murmured, the word queen sending an unexpected jolt through her. "Are you here to mourn him, or take his throne?" The question hung in the air, heavy and charged with unspoken meaning. It was a challenge, a test. And in that moment, Serafina knew that her life, her carefully constructed world, had irrevocably changed. Antonio's death had not just left a void, it had opened a door. A door to a future she had never dared to imagine, a future fraught with danger, but also with the possibility of freedom. The game had started, the widow's gamble, and no return was allowed. She took a deep breath, the scent of the rain-soaked earth, the candles, and Luca's subtle, musky cologne filling her senses. It was a new beginning, cloaked in the darkness of an ending. What would she do? Chapter 2. Whispers of succession and hidden agendas. The wake was a blur of black-clad figures, hushed condolences, and the clinking of glasses filled with grappa. Serafina moved through it all like a ghost, her mind reeling. Luca's question echoed in her thoughts, a constant reminder of the precipice she stood upon. Mourn him, or take his throne. The traditional mourning period was 40 days, but Serafina knew that the machinations for succession had already begun. The Mancini family was one of the oldest and most powerful in the city, controlling vast territories and lucrative businesses, both legal and illegal. Antonio's death had created a power vacuum, and nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. She found herself cornered by Donatello in the library, a room filled with leather-bound books and the lingering scent of Antonio's favorite cigars. He poured them both a generous measure of amber liquid. "Serafina," he began, his voice low and conspiratorial, "you must understand the delicacy of the situation." She took a sip of the grappa, the fiery liquid burning a path down her throat. "I understand that Antonio is gone," she said, her voice carefully neutral. Donatello waved a dismissive hand. Of course. A terrible loss. But the family, the business, it must continue. Someone must take the reins. "And you believe that someone should be Marco?" Serafina asked, cutting to the chase. Donatello hesitated, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for eavesdroppers. "Marco is young, impetuous, but he is Antonio's brother. The bloodline." Serafina knew what he was implying. Tradition dictated that the leadership should pass to the next male heir. But Antonio had always been different. He had valued Serafina's opinion, her intelligence. He had even, on occasion, hinted that she had a role to play, a role beyond that of the traditional mafia wife. "Antonio trusted me," she said, her voice firm. Donatello's eyebrows rose. "He trusted you as a wife. But this is different. This is the business. This is the family. And I am part of this family," Serafina countered. "I have been for 10 years. I know the secrets. I know the players." Donatello studied her, his gaze assessing. "You are a strong woman, Serafina. But strength alone is not enough. You need guidance, protection. And you believe Marco can provide that?" Serafina asked, a hint of challenge in her voice. Donatello sighed. "Marco, he needs a strong hand. Someone to temper his ambition." He paused, then added, "Perhaps a partnership. A marriage of convenience." Serafina felt a cold knot form in her stomach. A marriage of convenience. To Marco. The thought was repulsive. She had endured one loveless marriage. She would not enter another. "I need time to think, Donatello," she said, her voice tight. He nodded, seemingly relieved that she hadn't rejected the idea outright.
"Of course, my dear. Take your time.
But remember, the family's future rests on your decision." She excused herself and retreated to the relative privacy of her bedroom, the only room in the villa that felt truly hers. It was a sanctuary, decorated in soft shades of cream and lavender, a stark contrast to the heavy, masculine decor of the rest of the house. She changed out of the suffocating black dress and into a simple silk robe. As she brushed her long, dark hair, she caught sight of her reflection in the antique mirror. She looked pale and drawn, but there was a spark of defiance in her eyes. She was not the same woman who had entered this house 10 years ago, a naive young bride, full of romantic illusions. She had learned, she had adapted, she had survived. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts.
"Signora?"
It was Luca's voice. She hesitated for a moment, then opened the door. He stood in the hallway, his expression unreadable. "May I come in?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside to let him enter. He closed the door behind him, the sound echoing in the quiet room. "I wanted to check on you," he said, his voice low. "It's been a long day." "It has," she agreed, turning to face him. "And it's only going to get longer." He studied her, his gaze intense. "Donatello spoke to you." It wasn't a question. "He did," Serafina confirmed. "He suggested a solution." "A solution that involves Marco," Luca said, his voice flat. Serafina nodded. "A marriage of convenience. To secure the family's future." Luca's jaw tightened. "And what did you say?" "I said I needed time to think," Serafina replied. He took a step closer, his presence filling the room. "Do you need time to think, Serafina?" he asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Or do you already know the answer?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw something in his eyes, something beyond loyalty, beyond duty. She saw desire. A desire that mirrored her own, a desire that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. She began, but the words caught in her throat. He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek. His touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. "Don't do it, Serafina," he said, his voice rough. "Don't marry him." "But the family," she whispered. "The family will survive," he said. "But you deserve more." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a fleeting touch, a promise of something more. And in that moment, Serafina knew that she couldn't go through with it. She couldn't marry Marco. She couldn't betray the feelings that were now, finally, out in the open. The soft rain outside pattered against the window, a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent night. The decision was made, but the consequences, those were yet to be seen. What would tomorrow bring? Chapter 3. An unexpected alliance begins to form. The kiss, brief as it was, had changed everything. Serafina had spent the night tossing and turning Luca's words, his touch, replaying in her mind. You deserve more. The idea, once a distant fantasy, now felt like a tangible possibility. She rose early, before the rest of the household stirred. The villa was still shrouded in a pre-dawn gloom, the silence broken only by the occasional creak of the old house settling. She dressed in a simple black sweater and trousers, forgoing the elaborate morning attire she had worn the previous day. She needed to be comfortable, both physically and mentally, for the confrontation she knew was coming. She found Luca in the kitchen making coffee. He looked up as she entered, his dark eyes searching hers. He had changed too. The formal deference of the soldato was gone, replaced by a raw intensity that both thrilled and frightened her. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Good morning," she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. He poured her a cup of the strong, black coffee, their fingers brushing as she took it from him. The simple contact sent a jolt of electricity through her. "I've been thinking," she said, taking a sip of the coffee, needing the caffeine to steady her nerves. "About?" he asked, leaning against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. "About what you said." "About Marco." about the family. She paused, taking a deep breath. I can't marry him, Luca. I won't. A flicker of relief crossed his face, quickly replaced by a look of concern. Serafina, this is dangerous. Donatello, Marco, they won't let this go easily.
I know, she said.
But I'm not afraid. Not anymore. He studied her for a moment, his gaze assessing. You've changed, he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Antonio's death, it woke me up, she said. I spent 10 years playing a role, living a life that wasn't mine. I won't do it anymore. What will you do? He asked. She met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. I will take what is rightfully mine. I will lead the family. The words hung in the air, bold and defiant. Luca's expression shifted, surprise giving way to something akin to respect. You know that will mean war, he said. I'm prepared for that, Serafina replied. But I won't do it alone. She paused, then added, I need your help, Luca. He straightened, his eyes locking with hers. You have it, he said, his voice firm. Always. It was a declaration, a pledge of loyalty, but it was more than that. It was a promise, a commitment, a forging of an alliance that went beyond the traditional boundaries of capo and soldato. They spent the next few hours discussing strategy. Luca knew the inner workings of the family, the strengths and weaknesses of each member, the alliances and rivalries that existed within the complex network of the city's underworld. He laid it all out for Serafina, his voice calm and methodical, his knowledge vast and intricate. Donatello is the biggest threat, he said. He has the respect of the older generation, the traditionalists. He will push for Marco, not just for the bloodline, but because he believes he can control him. And Marco? Serafina asked. Marco is ambitious, but he's also reckless, Luca replied. He lacks Antonio's finesse. He's prone to violence, to making rash decisions. And Isabella?
Luca hesitated.
Isabella is complicated. She resents the fact that she was born a woman, that she can never inherit the leadership. She's intelligent, cunning, but she's also bitter. So, we need to neutralize Donatello, control Marco, and figure out what to do with Isabella, Serafina summarized. Essentially, Luca agreed. But it won't be easy. They have allies, resources, years of experience. We have something they don't have, Serafina said, a steely glint in her eyes. What's that? Luca asked. The element of surprise, she replied. They expect me to be the grieving widow, to be weak, to be easily manipulated. They underestimate me. Luca smiled a slow, knowing smile. They do, he agreed. And that will be their downfall. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. The touch was both comforting and electrifying. We'll do this together, Serafina, he said, his voice low and intimate. I swear to you, I will protect you. I will stand by you no matter what. She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and excitement. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger, but she was no longer alone. She had Luca, and together, they would face whatever came their way. She looked outside, the early morning sun casting a golden glow on the estate's gardens. A new day had begun, carrying the weight of unspoken promises and a budding, dangerous alliance. What challenges awaited them in the shadows? Chapter 4. The Weight of Legacy and Unspoken Desires. The days following Antonio's funeral were a tense dance of veiled threats and strategic maneuvers. Serafina, with Luca at her side, began to assert her presence, subtly at first, then with increasing confidence. She attended meetings with the family's consigliere, listened to their reports, asked pointed questions, and, most importantly, started making decisions. She discovered that Antonio had left behind a surprisingly detailed will, a document that had been kept secret from everyone except Luca and the family lawyer, a wizened old man named Salvatore. The will, while acknowledging the traditions of the family, also contained a clause that gave Serafina significant control over the family's assets, both legal and illegal. It was a loophole, a carefully crafted escape hatch that Antonio had provided for her, a testament to his trust and, perhaps, his love. Serafina used the will as leverage, subtly reminding Donatello and Marco that she was not without power. She also began to cultivate relationships with some of the younger, more progressive members of the family, those who were weary of the old ways, of the endless cycle of violence. She found an unexpected ally in Giovanni, Antonio's cousin, a man known for his sharp mind and his disdain for bloodshed. "Serafina," Giovanni said to her one afternoon, as they sat in the villa's sun-drenched conservatory, "you have a chance to change things, to modernize the family, to move away from the barbaric practices of the past." "I want that, Giovanni," Serafina replied. "But it won't be easy. The old guard, they cling to tradition." "Tradition is a cage," Giovanni said, his voice firm. "It stifles growth. It breeds resentment. You have the opportunity to break free." His words resonated with Serafina. She had felt the stifling weight of tradition for years, the constraints it placed upon her, the expectations it demanded. She was determined to forge a different path, not just for herself, but for the future of the family. But the weight of legacy was heavy. She felt the pressure of generations of Mancinis, their triumphs and failures, their blood feuds, and their unbreakable bonds. She felt the ghost of Antonio, his presence lingering in the villa, in the whispers of the family, in the eyes of Luca. The unspoken desires between her and Luca grew stronger with each passing day. They worked closely together, spending hours poring over documents, strategizing, planning. The physical proximity, the shared danger, the mutual respect, it all fueled the fire that burned between them. One evening, after a particularly grueling meeting with the family's accountants, they found themselves alone in Antonio's study. The room was filled with the scent of leather and old books, a reminder of the man who had once occupied this space, the man who had brought them together. Serafina stood by the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. She felt exhausted, overwhelmed by the enormity of the task she had undertaken. Luca came up behind her, his presence a comforting warmth. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "It's a lot, isn't it?" he said, his voice soft. She nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "Sometimes I feel like I'm drowning," she confessed. He placed his hands on her shoulders, his touch gentle but firm. "You're not drowning, Serafina," he said. "You're swimming. And you're strong." She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "I couldn't do this without you, Luca," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You don't have to," he said. "I'm here. I'll always be here." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, a release of the pent-up tension that had been building between them. It was a kiss of comfort, of reassurance, of desire. Serafina responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming more passionate, more urgent. It was a release of all the emotions they had been suppressing, the grief, the fear, the longing. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. The unspoken question hung in the air. "What now?" Serafina, Luca began, his voice rough with emotion. But before he could say more, a sharp knock on the door interrupted them. It was Alessandro, his face pale and worried. Signor Luca," he said, his voice urgent. "There's been a development. Donatello has called an emergency meeting of the family council. He says it's urgent." The spell was broken. The reality of their situation came crashing down upon them. The game was still on, and they were players, whether they liked it or not. The kiss, the promise, the vulnerability, all of it was pushed aside, replaced by the chilling urgency of Alessandro's words. What had Donatello done? Chapter 5. A dance of deception and dangerous truths. The emergency meeting was held in the villa's grand dining room, a cavernous space dominated by a long, mahogany table that could seat 20. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from the flickering candles in the ornate candelabras that adorned the table. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the occasional nervous cough. Serafina and Luca arrived together, their presence immediately drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Donatello sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of grim determination. Marco sat to his right, his expression smug and confident. Isabella sat to Donatello's left, her sharp eyes fixed on Serafina. The rest of the family council, a mix of older, traditionalist Cappy and younger, more ambitious lieutenants, filled the remaining seats. Serafina, Donatello said, his voice cold and formal. We have called this meeting to discuss certain matters of concern. Serafina met his gaze, her expression unwavering. What matters are those, Donatello? She asked, her voice calm and controlled. Donatello gestured to Marco, who stood up, a smirk playing on his lips. We have received information, Marco said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That suggests you have been mismanaging the family's assets. Serafina felt a surge of anger, but she kept her composure. Mismanaging? She asked, raising an eyebrow. I have been following Antonio's will to the letter. The will, Marco scoffed. A document written by a dying man, a man clearly not in his right mind. Antonio was perfectly lucid when he wrote that will, Luca interjected, his voice sharp. And Salvatore, the family lawyer, can attest to that. Donatello held up a hand, silencing Luca. We are not here to debate the validity of the will, he said. We are here to discuss Serafina's actions. He produced a stack of documents, handing them to Marco, who began to distribute them around the table. Serafina recognized them. They were financial records, bank statements, property deeds. But something was wrong. The numbers had been altered, the dates changed, the signatures forged. These documents, Marco said, his voice triumphant, clearly show that Serafina has been diverting funds, selling off properties, making deals without the consent of the family council. Serafina felt a cold dread creeping into her heart. She had been framed, and she knew who was behind it. She looked at Isabella, who met her gaze with a chilling smile. It was a subtle smile, barely perceptible, but it spoke volumes. Isabella had been playing a double game, pretending to be neutral, while secretly plotting against her. These are lies, Serafina said, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. These documents have been falsified. Falsified?
Marco laughed.
By whom, Serafina? By you? I did not do this, Serafina insisted. I have been framed. The members of the family council murmured amongst themselves, their faces a mixture of doubt and suspicion. Donatello watched her, his expression unreadable. Serafina, he said, his voice grave, these are serious accusations. If these documents are genuine, it means you have betrayed the family. And betrayal has consequences. The unspoken threat hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Serafina knew the consequences. Exile, imprisonment, or worse. She looked at Luca, her eyes pleading for help. He met her gaze, his expression determined. We need to see the original documents, Luca said, his voice calm but firm. These copies could have been easily manipulated. The originals are unavailable, Marco said, a smirk playing on his lips. Unavailable?
Luca challenged.
Or destroyed?
Marco shrugged.
They are simply not here. Serafina knew they were trapped. Without the original documents, she had no way to prove her innocence. She was at the mercy of Donatello and Marco, and she knew they would show her none. I demand a trial, Serafina said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. A trial by the family council. Let them decide my fate. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to buy time, to find a way out of this trap. But it was also a challenge, a declaration that she would not go down without a fight. Donatello considered her request, his eyes narrowed. He knew that a trial would be risky, that it could expose the divisions within the family, that it could even lead to a civil war. But he also knew that he couldn't simply dismiss her. He slowly nodded. Very well, he rasped. A trial it is. The air in the room shifted, settling into a heavy quiet. A trial. But what would be the cost, and who would pay it? The dangerous truths were laid bare, but their repercussions were still unknown. Chapter 6. Echoes of the past haunt the present. The days leading up to the trial were filled with a suffocating tension. Serafina and Luca worked tirelessly, trying to find evidence to counter the forged documents, to uncover Isabella's treachery, to rally support within the family. But it was like trying to fight a ghost. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every potential ally seemed to waver. Serafina found herself haunted by memories of Antonio. She would wander through the villa, touching the objects he had touched, breathing in the lingering scent of his cigars, trying to find some guidance, some solace in his memory. She remembered their wedding day, the lavish ceremony, the opulent reception, the forced smiles. She remembered the early years of their marriage, the loneliness, the isolation, the gradual realization that she was nothing more than a trophy wife, a pawn in Antonio's game. But she also remembered the moments of genuine connection, the rare glimpses of vulnerability, the times when Antonio had seemed to see her, to truly see her, not just as his wife, but as a woman, as an individual. She remembered one particular evening, years ago, when they had been sitting on the terrace, overlooking the city. Antonio had been unusually quiet, reflective. "Serafina," he had said, his voice low, "do you ever regret this life?" She had been surprised by the question. She had never dared to express her true feelings, to admit her unhappiness. "Regret?" she had asked, carefully choosing her words. "This is the life I was born into. The life I accepted." Antonio had nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "But is it the life you want?" he had pressed. She had hesitated, unsure how to answer. She had begun, but the words had caught in her throat. Antonio had reached out, his hand covering hers. His touch had been surprisingly gentle. "There is more to you, Serafina," he had said. "More than you know. More than you allow yourself to be." His words had stayed with her, a seed of doubt planted in the fertile ground of her discontent. And now, with Antonio gone, that seed was finally sprouting, pushing its way through the hardened soil of her resignation. She realized that Antonio had seen her potential, her strength, her intelligence. He had known that she was capable of more than just being a decorative wife. He had, in his own way, been preparing her for this moment, for this challenge. The realization gave her a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to fight not just for her own survival, but for the future Antonio had envisioned for her, for the family. But the past held other, darker secrets. One evening, while searching through Antonio's old files, Luca discovered a hidden compartment in his desk. Inside, they found a small, leather-bound journal. It was Antonio's diary, a record of his thoughts, his fears, his secrets. As Serafina began to read the journal, she uncovered a side of Antonio she had never known. She learned about his struggles with his own conscience, his doubts about the Mafia life, his growing disillusionment with the violence and the betrayal. She also learned about a secret affair, a passionate relationship with a woman outside the family, a woman named Juliana. The affair had lasted for years, hidden from everyone, a secret that Antonio had guarded fiercely. The discovery shocked Serafina, but it also gave her a strange sense of empathy for Antonio. He had been trapped, just like her, trapped by the expectations of his family, by the weight of his legacy. But the journal also contained a clue, a cryptic reference to a meeting, a deal, a betrayal that had occurred years ago, a betrayal that had involved Donatello, Marco, and Isabella. Serafina realized that the forged documents, the accusations against her, were not just about seizing power. They were about covering up something much bigger, something that had happened long ago, something that could destroy the family. The echoes of that long-ago betrayal were now threatening to consume her. She looked at Luca, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We need to find out what happened," she said. "We need to uncover the truth." Luca nodded, his jaw set. "We will," he said. Together. The journal was a map to a buried past, a past filled with secrets and lies. And as they prepared to delve into that past, Serafina knew that the trial was not just about her future, it was about the very soul of the Mancini family. The weight of all that history pressed down on her, mingling with the scent of old paper and Antonio's lingering cologne. What darkness would they unearth? Chapter 7. Betrayal Unveiled in the Heart of the Family. The trial was held in the same grand dining room where the accusations had been made. The atmosphere was even more charged, the air thick with anticipation. The members of the family council were assembled, their faces grim, their eyes fixed on Serafina. Donatello, as the acting head of the family, presided over the proceedings. Marco, acting as accuser, presented his case, reiterating the claims of Serafina's financial mismanagement, brandishing the forged documents as proof. Serafina, with Luca at her side, listened patiently, her expression calm and controlled. She knew that she couldn't simply deny the accusations. She needed to present a counter-narrative, a different version of the truth. When it was her turn to speak, she rose, her voice clear and strong. "These documents," she said, gesturing to the stack of papers on the table, "are forgeries. They are part of a deliberate attempt to discredit me, to remove me from power." She then presented her own evidence, the clause in Antonio's will that gave her control over the family's assets, the testimony of Salvatore, the family lawyer, who confirmed the authenticity of the will and Antonio's mental capacity. But she knew that it wasn't enough. She needed to expose the real motive behind the accusations, the secret that Donatello, Marco, and Isabella were trying to hide. She took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. "This trial," she said, her voice ringing out in the silent room, "is not about financial mismanagement. It's about something that happened years ago, a betrayal that has been buried for far too long." She then recounted what she had learned from Antonio's journal, the cryptic references to a meeting, a deal, a betrayal involving Donatello, Marco, and Isabella. She spoke of Juliana, Antonio's secret lover, and the possibility that her existence played a role in the past events. The members of the family council listened in stunned silence. Donatello's face had turned pale, Marco's smirk had vanished, and Isabella's eyes were wide with shock. "I believe," Serafina continued, her voice unwavering, "that Donatello, Marco, and Isabella were involved in a scheme to defraud Antonio, to steal from the family. And when Antonio discovered their treachery, they dealt with him." The implication was clear. They had killed Antonio. A gasp went through the room. The accusation was shocking, audacious, but it was also plausible. It explained the forged documents, the urgency to remove Serafina, the desperation to silence her. Donatello rose, his voice trembling with rage. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "You have no proof. You are making wild accusations based on a dead man's ramblings." "I have proof," Serafina countered, "and I will present it." She then called her first witness, Giovanni, Antonio's cousin, the man who had encouraged her to modernize the family. Giovanni, looking nervous but resolute, testified that he had overheard a conversation between Donatello, Marco, and Isabella years ago, a conversation that had hinted at a secret deal, a betrayal of Antonio. He also testified that he had seen Isabella meeting with a known forger, a man who specialized in creating false documents. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was damning. It painted a picture of a conspiracy, a plot to overthrow Antonio, to seize control of the family. Serafina then called her second witness, Luca. Luca, his voice calm and steady, recounted his discovery of Antonio's journal, his investigation into the past, his growing suspicion that Donatello, Marco, and Isabella were involved in Antonio's death. He also revealed a crucial piece of information, that Juliana, Antonio's secret lover, had disappeared shortly after Antonio's death. He suggested that she had been silenced, eliminated to prevent her from revealing the truth. The testimony of Giovanni and Luca had shifted the momentum of the trial. The members of the family council, who had initially been skeptical of Serafina's claims, were now beginning to doubt Donatello, Marco, and Isabella. The tide had turned. The betrayal, once hidden in the shadows, was now exposed to the harsh light of truth. The silence in the room was broken only by Donatello's ragged breathing. The weight of the unveiled secret pressed down on everyone present. What would be the verdict? Chapter 8. The Price of Loyalty and the Cost of Freedom. The revelation of the long-buried betrayal sent shockwaves through the family council. Donatello, his face ashen, vehemently denied the accusations, calling them lies, fabrications, a desperate attempt to seize power. Marco, his usual bravado gone, remained silent, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Isabella, her composure finally shattered, broke down in tears, her sobs echoing in the silent chamber. Serafina watched them, her heart filled with a mixture of triumph and sorrow. She had exposed their treachery, but the cost had been high. The family was fractured, the bonds of loyalty broken, the future uncertain. The council, after hours of deliberation, reached a verdict. They found Donatello, Marco, and Isabella guilty of conspiracy, of financial fraud, and, implicitly, of involvement in Antonio's death. The punishment, according to the family's ancient code, was severe: exile. Donatello, stripped of his power and his prestige, was banished to a remote village in Sicily, his name forever disgraced. Marco, his ambition crushed, was sent to South America to manage the family's less savory businesses, a far cry from the leadership role he had craved. Isabella, her spirit broken, was confined to a convent, her life of luxury and intrigue replaced by a life of prayer and penance. It was a victory for Serafina, but it felt hollow. She had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The family was deeply divided, the wounds of betrayal still fresh. And she knew that there were still those who doubted her, who resented her, who would seek to undermine her authority. Lucas stood by her side, his presence a constant source of strength and support. He had been instrumental in uncovering the truth, in rallying support for her, in protecting her from her enemies. "You did it, Serafina," he said to her, his voice filled with admiration. "You brought them down." She looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it," she corrected. "Together." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes. "Together," he repeated. But their victory was bittersweet. The price of loyalty had been high, the cost of freedom even higher. The family had paid a heavy price for the sins of the past, and Serafina knew that her own journey was just beginning. She was now the capo, the leader of the Mancini family, a role she had never sought, a role she had never imagined. She had a responsibility to rebuild the family, to heal the wounds, to forge a new path, a path that moved away from the violence and the betrayal of the past. She also had to confront her own feelings for Luca. The trial had brought them closer than ever, their bond forged in the crucible of danger and shared purpose. The unspoken desires that had simmered between them were now undeniable, impossible to ignore. One evening, as they stood on the terrace, overlooking the city, she turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. "Luca," she began, her voice trembling, "what happens now? With us?" He met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of tenderness and longing. "What do you want to happen, Serafina?" he asked, his voice low and intimate. She took a deep breath, her courage bolstered by his unwavering gaze. "I want you," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "I want us." He reached out, his hand gently cupping her face. "And I want you, Serafina," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "More than anything." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that promised a future together, a future free from the shadows of the past. It was a kiss that spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of a love born in the heart of darkness. But as they embraced, a distant sound, a faint echo of a gunshot, shattered the peace. The past, it seemed, was not yet ready to let them go. The cost had been paid, but was it enough? The distant gunshot was a stark reminder what new threat lurked in the shadows. Chapter 9. A glimmer of hope in a sea of darkness. The gunshot, though distant, sent a chill through Serafina. The fragile peace she had begun to feel, the nascent hope for a future with Luca, shattered in an instant. Old fears resurfaced, the constant vigilance of Mafia life reasserting itself. "Stay here," Luca said, his voice sharp, his hand instinctively moving to the gun he carried concealed beneath his jacket. He was instantly the soldado again, his protective instincts kicking in. Serafina, however, grabbed his arm. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We go together." She was no longer the passive wife, content to stay behind, to be protected. She was the capo, and she would face whatever danger lay ahead alongside Luca. They moved quickly, silently, through the villa, their senses on high alert. Alessandro, his face etched with worry, met them in the hallway. "Signora, Signor Luca," he said, his voice urgent. It came from the east gate. "The guards are checking it out." The east gate was the most vulnerable point of the estate, a long, winding driveway that led to a secluded road. It was the perfect place for an ambush. They reached the gate, finding the two guards, young men barely out of their teens, looking shaken but unharmed. "What happened?"
Luca demanded.
We heard a shot," one of the guards stammered. "We saw a car speeding away. We couldn't get a good look at it." Luca examined the scene, his eyes scanning the ground, the trees, the shadows. He found a single shell casing, a small piece of metal that held the key to the mystery. 9mm, he said, his voice grim. "Professional." This wasn't a random act of violence. Serafina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Someone was sending them a message. But who? And what did they want? The obvious answer was the remnants of Donatello's faction, those who had remained loyal to the old regime, those who resented Serafina's rise to power. But Luca had been meticulous in tracking down and neutralizing any potential threats, exiling those who posed the greatest danger, offering amnesty to those who were willing to swear allegiance to Serafina. Could there be another enemy? Someone they had overlooked? Someone lurking in the shadows, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The days that followed were filled with a renewed sense of unease. Serafina increased security at the villa, doubled the patrols, tightened the vetting process for all employees. She also reached out to her allies within the family, Giovanni and a few others she trusted, asking them to keep their ears open, to report any suspicious activity. Despite the tension, she and Luca found moments of solace in each other's company. They would steal away to the garden, to the library, to her bedroom, finding comfort in their shared intimacy, in the unspoken promise of a future together. One evening, as they sat in the garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, Luca turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and concern. "Serafina," he said, his voice soft, "I want to protect you. I want to keep you safe. But I also want more." She met his gaze, her heart filled with a longing that mirrored his own. "What do you mean?" she asked, although she already knew the answer. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. "I want to marry you, Serafina," he said, his voice firm. "I want to be your husband, not just your soldado. I want to build a life with you, a life free from the shadows, a life filled with love." The words took her breath away. It was everything she had ever dreamed of, everything she had ever wanted. But the reality of their situation, the dangers that surrounded them, cast a shadow over her happiness. "Luca," she said, her voice trembling, "I love you. I want to marry you too. But is it possible? Can we ever truly be free from this life?" He squeezed her hand, his gaze unwavering. "We can," he said. "We have to. We'll create our own freedom, Serafina. We'll build a new legacy, a legacy based on trust, on respect, on love, not on fear and violence." His words gave her hope, a glimmer of light in the sea of darkness that surrounded them. She leaned in, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was both passionate and tender, a kiss that sealed their commitment, a kiss that spoke of a future they would fight for, together. The beauty of the sunset, the warmth of Luca's hand in hers, it all felt like a fragile promise. But the echo of the gunshot still lingered. Could they truly escape the darkness? Chapter 10. Secrets shared under the cloak of night. The proposal, whispered amidst the lingering threat, hung between them like a fragile promise. Serafina and Luca knew that their desire for a normal life, for a marriage free from the constant shadow of the Mafia, was a dangerous dream. But it was a dream they were determined to pursue. They began to make plans, cautiously, secretly. They decided to keep their engagement hidden for the time being, fearing the reaction of the family, the potential for sabotage from their enemies. They knew that they needed to consolidate their power, to secure their position, before they could openly declare their love. One night, under the cloak of darkness, they met in Serafina's bedroom, the only place in the villa where they felt truly safe, truly alone. The room was dimly lit, the only illumination coming from a single candle on the bedside table. The air was thick with the scent of lavender and the unspoken tension of their situation. Serafina was sitting on the bed, dressed in a simple silk robe, her long, dark hair cascading down her back. Luca was standing by the window, looking out at the city lights, his expression troubled. "What is it, Luca?" Serafina asked, her voice soft, concerned. He turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of worry and determination. "I've been doing some digging," he said, his voice low, "trying to figure out who was behind that gunshot." Serafina felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach.
"And?"
she prompted. "It's not Donatello's people," Luca said. "I'm sure of it. They're scattered, disorganized, they don't have the resources for something like this." "Then who?" Serafina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Luca hesitated, his gaze searching hers. "I think it might be someone closer to home," he said. Serafina felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I think it might be Isabella," Luca said, his voice grim. Serafina was shocked. "Isabella? But she's in a convent. She's powerless." "She's not powerless," Serafina, Luca said. "She still has connections. She still has influence. And she has a motive. Revenge." He explained that he had discovered that Isabella, despite her confinement, had been secretly communicating with some of her loyal followers, using a network of corrupt nuns and guards. He believed that she was plotting to undermine Serafina, to destabilize the family, to reclaim her lost power. The news was devastating. Serafina had hoped that Isabella's exile would bring an end to the internal conflicts, that the family could finally begin to heal. But it seemed that the past, like a persistent ghost, refused to stay buried. "What do we do?" Serafina asked, her voice filled with despair. Luca came to her, sitting beside her on the bed, taking her hand in his. "We expose her," he said, his voice firm. "We gather evidence. We present it to the family council. We show them that she is still a threat." "But how?" Serafina asked. "She's in a convent. It's a fortress. We have allies," Luca said. "We have Giovanni. And we have others." He then revealed a secret that he had been keeping from Serafina, a secret that went back to his days as Antonio's enforcer. He told her about a network of informants, spies, and operatives that he had cultivated over the years, a network that extended throughout the city, throughout the country, even beyond. These were men and women who owed their loyalty to Luca, who were willing to risk their lives for him. They were his eyes and ears, his secret weapon. Serafina was amazed. She had always known that Luca was resourceful, that he had connections, but she had never realized the extent of his power, his influence. "I never knew," she said, her voice filled with awe. He smiled, a wry, knowing smile. "There are many things you don't know about me, Serafina," he said. He then began to share some of those secrets, telling her about his past, his family, his early days in the Mafia, his rise through the ranks. He told her about the violence he had witnessed, the violence he had participated in, the regrets he carried. He also told her about his love for Antonio, his respect for his capo, his loyalty that had extended beyond duty. He confessed that he had always admired Serafina, that he had seen her strength, her intelligence, her beauty, even when she had been trapped in the role of the dutiful wife. He shared everything, every fear, every hope. As he spoke, Serafina felt a deeper connection to him, a bond that went beyond passion, beyond desire. She saw his vulnerability, his humanity, his goodness, beneath the hardened exterior of the soldado. They spent the rest of the night talking, sharing their secrets, their fears, their hopes. They made love, their bodies entwined, their souls connected, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. The secrets, shared under the cloak of night, had strengthened their bond. But Isabella's threat remained. What would be their next move against such a cunning, hidden enemy? Chapter 11. The lines between duty and desire blur. With the knowledge of Isabella's continued machinations, Serafina and Luca knew they had to act swiftly and decisively. The threat was no longer abstract, it was a viper coiled in the heart of their own family, ready to strike. Luca, using his network of informants, began to gather evidence of Isabella's communications, her contacts, her plans. It was a dangerous game, requiring stealth and precision. One wrong move could expose them, alerting Isabella and giving her time to cover her tracks. Serafina, meanwhile, focused on consolidating her power within the family. She met with the various capi, listening to their concerns, addressing their grievances, offering them reassurances. She used her intelligence, her charm, and the leverage of Antonio's will to win their loyalty, to convince them that she was the best leader for the family, the only one who could guide them through these turbulent times. The lines between duty and desire began to blur. Their shared mission, the constant threat, the need for secrecy, it all fueled the passion that burned between them. They would steal moments together, a quick embrace in the hallway, a stolen kiss in the garden, a shared glance across the crowded dining room. One afternoon, they found themselves alone in Antonio's study, reviewing the evidence Luca had gathered against Isabella. The room was filled with the scent of leather and old books, a reminder of the man who had brought them together, the man whose legacy they were now fighting to protect. Serafina was poring over a document, a transcript of a phone call between Isabella and one of her loyalists, a conversation that clearly implicated her in a plot to sabotage Serafina's efforts to modernize the family's businesses. Luca was standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his breath warm on her neck. He leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're amazing, you know that?" he whispered. "The way you handle them, the way you command their respect, Antonio would be proud." Serafina felt a shiver run down her spine, a mixture of pleasure and sadness. She turned to face him, her eyes searching his. "Do you think so?" she asked, her voice soft. "Or, do you think he would be disappointed? That I'm betraying his legacy?" Luca cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheekbones. "You're not betraying his legacy, Serafina," he said, his voice firm. "You're honoring it. You're taking what he built and making it better, stronger, more just." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both tender and passionate, a kiss that erased all doubts, all fears, all insecurities. It was a kiss that spoke of their love, their commitment, their shared purpose. They broke apart, breathless, their eyes locked. The unspoken question hung in the air. How long could they continue like this, living in the shadows, stealing moments, denying their love? "We need to tell them," Serafina said, her voice resolute. "We need to tell the family about us." Luca hesitated, his expression troubled. "Are you sure, Serafina?" he asked. "It's risky. It could divide the family even further. It could give Isabella more ammunition." "I know," Serafina said. "But I can't live like this anymore, Luca. I can't hide my feelings, pretend that you're nothing more than my enforcer. I love you, and I want the world to know." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes. "I love you too, Serafina," he said. "And I want the same thing." He gently pulled her closer. They decided to call a meeting of the family council to present their evidence against Isabella and to announce their engagement. It was a bold move, a gamble, but it was one they were willing to take. They were prepared to face whatever consequences came their way, as long as they faced them together. The decision, born out of love and necessity, was made. The blurring lines had solidified into a single path. What reaction awaited them from the council? Chapter 12. A test of faith and a leap of courage. The announcement of their engagement, coupled with the presentation of evidence against Isabella, was met with a mixture of shock, disbelief, and cautious approval from the family council. Serafina, standing beside Luca, addressed them with a calm confidence that belied the turmoil she felt inside. "I know this is unexpected," she said, her voice echoing in the grand dining room. "But Luca and I have come to care for each other deeply. Our relationship is not a betrayal of Antonio's memory, but a continuation of his vision for a stronger, more unified family. She then presented the evidence Luca had gathered, the transcripts of Isabella's phone calls, the testimonies of his informants, the proof of her continued efforts to undermine Serafina's leadership. The evidence was irrefutable, damning. The council members, initially stunned by the news of the engagement, were now faced with the undeniable reality of Isabella's treachery. The older, more traditional Capi, who had been skeptical of Serafina's leadership, were forced to reconsider their position. Isabella, the seemingly pious and powerless nun, had been revealed as a cunning and dangerous enemy. Giovanni, Antonio's cousin and Serafina's ally, spoke in their support. Serafina and Luca have proven their loyalty to the family, he said, his voice firm. They have risked their lives to protect us, to expose Isabella's treachery. They deserve our respect, our support, and our blessing. His words swayed many of the undecided members. The council, after a tense deliberation, voted to formally condemn Isabella, stripping her of her remaining influence and severing all her connections to the outside world. They also, albeit with some reservations, gave their blessing to Serafina and Luca's engagement. It was a victory, a testament to Serafina's leadership and Luca's unwavering support. But it was also a fragile victory. They knew that there were still those who opposed them, who resented their relationship, who saw them as a threat to the old ways. As they left the meeting, hand in hand, they were met by Alessandro, his face etched with worry. Signora, Senior Luca, he said, his voice urgent, there's been another incident. At the warehouse. The one near the docks. The warehouse was a key part of the family's operations, a storage facility for both legal and illegal goods. An attack on the warehouse was a direct challenge to Serafina's authority, a sign that their enemies were not yet defeated. What happened?
Luca demanded.
Explosion, Alessandro said, his voice grim. Significant damage.
No casualties, thankfully.
But it was deliberate.
A bomb.
Serafina felt a surge of anger, frustration, and a renewed sense of determination. They had won the battle against Isabella, but the war was far from over. Someone was still out there, someone who wanted to destroy them, to destroy everything they had built. We need to find out who's behind this, Serafina said, her voice firm. And we need to stop them. Before it's too late. Luca nodded, his jaw set.
We will, he said.
Together. They knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they also knew that they had each other, that their love was a source of strength, a beacon of hope in the darkness that surrounded them. They decided to visit the warehouse, to assess the damage, to gather any clues that might lead them to the perpetrators. It was a risk, exposing themselves to potential danger, but it was a risk they were willing to take. They needed to show their enemies that they were not afraid, that they would not be intimidated. It was a test of their courage and a demonstration of their unity. What would they uncover at the damaged warehouse? Chapter 13. The gathering storm of rival factions. The scene at the warehouse was one of controlled chaos. Firefighters were still dousing the smoldering remains of the explosion, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and burnt chemicals. Police officers, their faces grim, were cordoning off the area, collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses. Serafina and Luca, accompanied by Alessandro and a few trusted guards, surveyed the damage. The explosion had ripped through the main building, leaving a gaping hole in the roof, collapsing walls, and scattering debris everywhere. It was a miracle that no one had been killed. It was a professional job, Luca said, his voice grim, examining the remnants of the detonated device. Timed explosive. Placed strategically to cause maximum damage.
But why?
Serafina asked, her voice filled with frustration. What do they gain from this? It's not just an attack on us, it's an attack on the family, on the business. Luca hesitated, his gaze searching hers. I think it might be more than just an attack, he said. I think it might be a message. A message from whom? Serafina asked. From someone who wants to take over, Luca said. Someone who wants to destabilize the family, to create chaos, to seize control. He explained that he had been receiving reports from his informants, whispers of a growing unrest among the other mafia families in the city. They had been watching the internal conflicts within the Mancini family, the power struggles, the betrayals, and they saw an opportunity. An opportunity to weaken the Mancinis, to take their territory, to expand their own influence. The explosion, Luca believed, was a warning, a show of force, a declaration of intent. The other families were circling, like sharks sensing blood in the water. Serafina felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on the internal threats, on Donatello, on Isabella, that she had overlooked the external dangers. She had underestimated the ruthlessness of the other families, their willingness to exploit any weakness, any vulnerability. "Who is it, Luca?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper.
"Who's leading this?" "I'm not sure," Luca said.
"But I have my suspicions. The Salieri family. They've always been our rivals, always envious of our power, our territory. And their capo, Don Carlo Salieri, is a ruthless, ambitious man. The Salieri family was one of the most powerful and dangerous families in the city, known for their brutality, their ruthlessness, their willingness to break the unwritten rules of the Mafia code. They were a formidable enemy, one that Serafina had hoped to avoid confronting. "We need to be prepared," Serafina said, her voice firm. "We need to strengthen our defenses, to shore up our alliances, to show them that we are not weak, that we will not be intimidated." Luca nodded, his jaw set. "We will," he said. "But we also need to be smart. We can't just react blindly. We need to find out their plans, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. We need to anticipate their moves." They spent the next few days working tirelessly, gathering intelligence, strengthening their security, reaching out to potential allies. They also began to make preparations for a possible war, stockpiling weapons, training their soldati, fortifying their strongholds. The city, once a familiar landscape, now felt like a battleground, a chessboard where every move could be deadly. The tension was palpable, the air thick with anticipation. The storm was gathering, the rival factions preparing for a clash that could determine the future of the city's underworld. Serafina and Luca knew they were running out of time. What move would Don Carlo Salieri make, and could they counter it? Chapter 14. Blood spilled and promises broken. The attack came swiftly and brutally, a coordinated assault on multiple Mancini-controlled businesses across the city. Restaurants were firebombed, warehouses were raided, and several of Serafina's lieutenants were ambushed and killed. It was a clear declaration of war from the Salieri family, a blatant attempt to cripple the Mancinis and seize control. Serafina and Luca, who had been expecting an attack but were still caught off guard by its ferocity, immediately went into crisis mode. They rallied their forces, mobilized their soldati, and prepared to retaliate. The city erupted into violence, a chaotic free for all of gunfights, car chases, and explosions. The streets, once bustling with life, became a war zone, the air filled with the sounds of sirens, screams, and gunfire. Serafina, despite her lack of experience in open warfare, proved to be a surprisingly effective leader. She was calm under pressure, decisive in her actions, and ruthless in her defense of her family. She worked closely with Luca, coordinating their strategy, directing their forces, and ensuring the safety of their people. But the Salieris were a formidable enemy, well-armed, well-organized, and utterly ruthless. They had the advantage of surprise, and they exploited it to the fullest. The Mancinis suffered heavy losses, their businesses decimated, their ranks thinned by the relentless attacks. One evening, as Serafina and Luca were meeting in the villa's war room, reviewing the latest reports, Alessandro burst in, his face pale and stricken. Signor Luca," he said, his voice trembling, "it's Giovanni. He's been shot." Giovanni, Antonio's cousin, Serafina's trusted ally, the man who had supported her from the beginning, had been ambushed while driving home from a meeting. He had been shot multiple times, his car riddled with bullets. Serafina felt a wave of grief and rage wash over her. Giovanni had been like a father figure to her, a mentor, a friend. His death was a devastating blow, both personally and strategically. "Is he?" Serafina asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alessandro shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "He's alive," he said, "but it's bad. He's in surgery." The doctors, they don't know if he'll make it. Serafina and Luca rushed to the hospital, their hearts pounding with fear and dread. They found Giovanni in the intensive care unit, hooked up to machines, his body battered and bruised, his breathing shallow and labored. The doctors, their faces grim, told them that Giovanni's condition was critical. He had lost a lot of blood, suffered severe internal injuries, and was fighting for his life. Serafina sat by Giovanni's bedside, holding his hand, her tears falling silently onto the crisp white sheets. She prayed, she pleaded, she bargained with any higher power that might be listening. She couldn't lose him. She wouldn't. Luca stood beside her, his presence a silent source of strength and support. He had lost many men in his life, but Giovanni's potential death hit him hard. He had respected Giovanni, admired his intelligence, his integrity, his unwavering loyalty. As they waited, agonizing hours stretching into an eternity, Serafina made a vow. She vowed that if Giovanni survived, she would do everything in her power to end this war, to bring peace to the family, to create a future where violence and betrayal were no longer the norm. She was tired of the bloodshed and promises broken between the families. But if he died, she would unleash hell upon the Salieris. She would avenge his death, and she would make them pay for their crimes. The vow, born of grief and rage, was a turning point. Would Giovanni survive, and would Serafina be able to keep her promise, whichever way it went? Chapter 15. Reclaiming Power, Embracing Vulnerability. After a grueling night of uncertainty, Giovanni pulled through. The doctors, amazed by his resilience, called it a miracle. Serafina, overwhelmed with relief, wept openly, her tears a mixture of joy and gratitude. Luca, his stoic facade cracking, embraced her, his own relief palpable. Giovanni's survival was a turning point, a catalyst for change. Serafina, fueled by her vow and emboldened by Giovanni's recovery, decided to take a different approach. She realized that she couldn't win this war through brute force alone. She needed to be smarter, more strategic, more diplomatic. She reached out to the other Mafia families in the city, the ones who had remained neutral in the conflict, the ones who were wary of the Salieri's growing power. She proposed a meeting, a summit, a chance to discuss a peaceful resolution, a way to end the bloodshed. It was a risky move, exposing herself to potential danger, but it was a risk she was willing to take. She knew that the other families were tired of the violence, the instability, the constant threat of war. They, like her, wanted peace, wanted a return to the old ways, the unwritten rules that had governed the city's underworld for decades. The meeting was held in a neutral location, a heavily guarded restaurant in Little Italy. Serafina, accompanied by Luca and a few trusted soldati, faced the leaders of the other families, their faces grim, their eyes wary. She spoke eloquently, passionately, appealing to their sense of reason, their sense of self-preservation. She argued that the war between the Mancinis and the Salieris was benefiting no one, that it was only weakening them all, making them vulnerable to outside threats, to law enforcement, to rival gangs. She proposed a truce, a ceasefire, a division of territory, a new set of rules that would ensure peace and stability. She offered concessions, compromises, a way for everyone to save face, to walk away with something. Her words resonated with many of the family leaders. They had seen the devastation, the loss of life, the economic damage caused by the war. They were tired of fighting, tired of living in fear. But Don Carlo Salieri, the capo of the Salieri family, remained defiant, his eyes filled with hatred and ambition. He refused to negotiate, refused to compromise, insisting that he would not rest until the Mancinis were destroyed. Serafina met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "You can choose war, Don Carlo," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But know this. If you continue down this path, you will face the combined might of all the families in this city. And you will lose." It was a bold statement, a gamble, but it was one that paid off. The other family leaders, seeing the determination in Serafina's eyes, the unwavering support of Luca and her soldati, sided with her. They pressured Don Carlo, threatening to withdraw their support, to join forces with the Mancinis if he refused to negotiate. Don Carlo, isolated and outnumbered, finally relented. He agreed to a truce, to a ceasefire, to a division of territory that was far less favorable than he had initially hoped for. It was a victory for Serafina, a testament to her leadership, her diplomacy, her courage. She had reclaimed power, not through violence, but through strategy, through alliance building, through embracing her vulnerability and appealing to the common good. As she and Luca left the meeting, exhausted but triumphant, they knew that the peace was fragile, that Don Carlo would likely seek revenge, that the threat of war still loomed. But for now, they had achieved the impossible. They had stopped the bloodshed, brokered a truce, and created a glimmer of hope for a more peaceful future. Serafina felt Luca's arm around her waist, a gesture of support and love. The victory was theirs, shared and hard-won. But what would Don Carlo's next move be, and how long would the fragile peace last? Chapter 16. The Unseen Scars of a Hidden War. The truce, fragile as it was, brought a period of relative calm to the city. The violence subsided, the businesses reopened, and the families began the slow process of rebuilding. Serafina, despite her outward confidence, was deeply affected by the war. The constant threat, the loss of life, the betrayal of those she had trusted, it had all taken a toll. She found herself struggling with nightmares, flashbacks, moments of intense anxiety. She would wake up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding, her body drenched in sweat, the images of the violence, the faces of the dead, haunting her. Luca, ever attentive, noticed her struggles. He would hold her, comfort her, reassure her, his presence a constant source of strength and support. He understood her pain, her trauma, for he carried his own scars from his years as a soldado, his own nightmares from the violence he had witnessed and participated in. One night, as she lay in his arms, unable to sleep, she confessed her fears, her doubts, her insecurities. "I don't know if I can do this, Luca," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know if I'm strong enough. I'm not like Antonio. I'm not a warrior." Luca held her tighter, his lips brushing against her forehead. "You are stronger than you think, Serafina," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You are a survivor. You are a leader. And you are not alone. I'm here. I'll always be here." He encouraged her to seek help, to talk to someone about her trauma, to find a way to heal. He knew that she needed to confront her demons, to process her emotions, if she was to truly move forward, to lead the family effectively. Serafina, initially resistant, finally agreed. She began to see a therapist, a discreet and trusted professional who specialized in treating trauma victims. It was difficult, painful, confronting her fears, reliving the horrors of the war, but it was also cathartic, liberating. She began to understand the unseen scars that the war had left on her, the emotional wounds that needed to be healed. She learned coping mechanisms, techniques for managing her anxiety, ways to process her grief and anger. As she healed, she also began to see her strengths in a new light. She realized that her vulnerability, her empathy, her compassion were not weaknesses, but assets. They allowed her to connect with people, to understand their needs, to lead with kindness and understanding. She also began to make changes within the family, implementing reforms that reflected her values, her vision for a more just and peaceful future. She established a fund to support the families of those who had been killed in the war, both Mancini and Salieri. She created programs to help young people escape the cycle of violence, to provide them with education, job training, opportunities for a better life. She also focused on strengthening the family's legitimate businesses, diversifying their investments, moving away from the traditional reliance on illegal activities. She wanted to create a legacy that was not built on fear and violence, but on respect and opportunity. Luca, meanwhile, focused on consolidating their security, strengthening their defenses, and monitoring the Salieris. He knew that Don Carlo was still a threat, that he was likely plotting his revenge, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The unseen scars of the war were a constant reminder of the fragility of peace, the ever-present threat of violence. But they were also a source of strength, a catalyst for change, a testament to Serafina's resilience and her determination to build a better future. The healing had begun, but vigilance was still paramount. What form would Don Carlo's inevitable revenge take? Chapter 17. A confrontation of wills and a clash of hearts. The inevitable confrontation with Don Carlo Salieri came not in the form of bullets and bombs, but in a far more subtle and insidious way. He began to use his influence, his connections, his wealth, to undermine Serafina's efforts to reform the family, to tarnish her reputation, to sow discord among her ranks. He spread rumors, false accusations, whispers of her weakness, her inexperience, her unnatural relationship with Luca. He bribed officials, corrupted politicians, manipulated the media, all in an effort to discredit her, to isolate her, to make her vulnerable. Serafina, initially blindsided by this new form of attack, found herself struggling to maintain control. The carefully constructed peace she had brokered began to crumble, the old rivalries and resentments resurfacing. Some of the Capi, swayed by Don Carlo's propaganda, began to question her leadership, to doubt her ability to protect them. Luca, sensing the danger, urged her to retaliate, to fight back with the same dirty tactics. But Serafina refused. She was determined to stay true to her values, to her vision for a different kind of family, a family that did not rely on lies, deceit, and manipulation. She decided to confront Don Carlo directly, to challenge him, to expose his treachery. She arranged a meeting, a private one-on-one, in a neutral location, a small, unassuming restaurant in the heart of the city. The meeting was tense, fraught with unspoken threats and veiled accusations. Don Carlo, his face a mask of smug confidence, denied any wrongdoing, claiming that he was simply protecting his family's interests, that Serafina was the one who was destabilizing the city, that she was unfit to lead. Serafina, her heart pounding but her voice steady, listened patiently, letting him speak, letting him reveal his arrogance, his contempt, his utter lack of remorse. Then, when he was finished, she calmly presented her evidence, the proof of his machinations, the testimonies of those he had bribed, the documents that exposed his lies. She laid it all out before him, a devastating indictment of his character, his actions, his betrayal of the Mafia code. Don Carlo, his composure finally shattered, sputtered, denied, threatened, but it was too late. Serafina had exposed him, not just to her, but to himself. She had shown him that she was not the weak, inexperienced woman he had underestimated. She was strong, intelligent, resourceful, and she was not afraid to fight for what she believed in. "You have a choice, Don Carlo," she said, her voice firm. "You can continue down this path, the path of lies and deceit, and you will destroy yourself, your family, everything you have built. Or you can accept the peace, accept the new order, and work with me to create a better future for all of us." Don Carlo stared at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and respect. He saw in her a strength that he had not anticipated, a determination that mirrored his own, but tempered with a compassion, a sense of justice, that he lacked. He knew that he had been defeated, not by force, but by something far more powerful, by integrity, by courage, by a vision of a better world. He slowly nodded, his voice barely a whisper. "I accept," he said. "I accept the peace." It was a victory, a hard-won victory, but it was also a turning point. Serafina had not only defeated her enemy, she had transformed him. She had shown him that there was another way, a better way, a way that did not rely on violence and betrayal. As she and Luca left the restaurant, hand in hand, they knew that the struggle was far from over, that there would be other challenges, other threats. But they also knew that they had faced the ultimate test, a confrontation of wills and a clash of hearts, and they had emerged victorious, their love strengthened, their resolve solidified. Don Carlo had yielded, his spirit seemingly broken. But could he truly be trusted, or was this another layer of deception? Chapter 18. The fragile bonds of trust tested. Don Carlo's surrender, while seemingly genuine, left Serafina and Luca with a lingering sense of unease. They had won the battle of wills, but they knew that trust, once broken, was difficult to restore. They continued to monitor Don Carlo's activities, keeping a close watch on his family, wary of any signs of treachery. Their focus, however, shifted to rebuilding the family, to strengthening their alliances, to implementing the reforms that Serafina had envisioned. They worked tirelessly, traveling across the city, meeting with the Capi, addressing their concerns, reassuring them of their commitment to a new era of peace and prosperity. One of their priorities was to formalize their relationship, to finally get married. They had postponed their wedding several times due to the constant threats and crises, but they were now determined to make it happen. They wanted to send a message to the family, to the city, that they were united, that their love was a symbol of hope, a promise of a brighter future. They planned a small, intimate ceremony, inviting only their closest friends and allies. They chose a beautiful, secluded villa in the countryside, a place far removed from the violence and the intrigue of the city. But even as they prepared for their wedding, the fragile bonds of trust that held the family together were tested once again. A series of minor incidents, seemingly unrelated, began to occur. A shipment of goods went missing, a key witness in a legal case recanted his testimony, a rumor of a planned attack circulated among the soldati. Serafina and Luca, initially dismissing these incidents as isolated occurrences, began to suspect a pattern. Someone was deliberately trying to sabotage their efforts, to undermine their authority, to create an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty. They launched a discreet investigation, using Luca's network of informants to gather information, to identify the source of the trouble. The evidence, slowly but surely, pointed to a surprising and disturbing conclusion. Don Carlo, despite his public surrender, was still secretly working against them. He had not abandoned his ambition, his desire for revenge. He was simply playing a different game, a more subtle, more insidious game. He was using his influence, his connections, his wealth, to create chaos, to weaken Serafina's position, to prepare for a final, decisive strike. Serafina was devastated. She had believed in Don Carlo's change of heart. She had trusted him. She had offered him a chance to redeem himself. But he had betrayed her. He had betrayed the peace. He had proven himself to be irredeemable. Luca was ready to strike, and hard. "We need to deal with him, Serafina," Luca said, his voice grim. "Once and for all. He's a snake. He'll never change." But Serafina hesitated. She was tired of the violence, the bloodshed, the endless cycle of revenge. She wanted to find another way, a way to end this conflict without resorting to the same brutal tactics that Don Carlo had used. She had a plan, a risky plan, a plan that relied on trust, on faith, on the belief that even the most hardened heart could be touched by compassion. It was a gamble, a desperate attempt to break the cycle of violence, to create a truly lasting peace. The plan was dangerous, and Luca vehemently opposed it. Could she convince him? And even if she did, would it work? Chapter 19. Reckoning with the Ghosts of Yesterday. Serafina's plan was audacious, bordering on reckless. She decided to confront Don Carlo again, but this time, not with accusations or threats, but with an offer of genuine reconciliation, a chance to truly bury the past and build a future together. Luca was vehemently opposed to the idea. He argued that Don Carlo was a liar, a manipulator, a man who could not be trusted. He feared that Serafina was walking into a trap, that she was putting herself and the family in mortal danger. "He'll betray you, Serafina," Luca said, his voice filled with concern. "He'll use this as an opportunity to strike. You can't trust him." "I have to try, Luca," Serafina replied, her voice firm. "I have to believe that there's still some good in him, that he can change. If I don't, then what hope do we have? What hope does any of us have?" She explained her plan in detail. She would meet with Don Carlo alone, unarmed, in a public place, a place where he could not easily harm her. She would offer him a partnership, a share in the family's legitimate businesses, a chance to use his considerable skills and connections for good, rather than for evil. She would also offer him something even more valuable, forgiveness. She would tell him that she forgave him for his past actions, for his betrayal, for his attempts to destroy her. She would offer him a clean slate, a chance to start over, to build a new legacy. Luca listened, his expression a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. He still thought it was a mistake, a dangerous gamble, but he also saw the strength in Serafina's conviction, the unwavering belief in her vision for a better future. "I don't like it, Serafina," he said. "But I trust you. I'll be there close by. If anything goes wrong, it won't," Serafina said, her voice confident. "I believe in this, Luca. I believe in the power of forgiveness. I believe in the possibility of change." The meeting was arranged. Serafina chose a busy outdoor cafe in the heart of the city, a place where they would be surrounded by people, a place where Don Carlo could not easily resort to violence. She arrived alone, unarmed, her heart pounding in her chest. She saw Don Carlo sitting at a table, his face a mask of cold indifference. He looked older, wearier, the weight of his past actions etched on his features. She sat down opposite him, her gaze unwavering. "Don Carlo," she said, her voice calm and steady. "Thank you for meeting me." He simply nodded, his eyes fixed on hers, searching for any sign of weakness, any hint of deception. Serafina began to speak, her words carefully chosen, her voice filled with sincerity. She told him that she knew about his continued efforts to undermine her, that she had evidence of his treachery. But she also told him that she did not want revenge, that she did not want more bloodshed. She offered him a partnership, a chance to join her in building a new future for the family, a future based on trust, on respect, on cooperation. She offered him forgiveness, a clean slate, a chance to redeem himself. Don Carlo listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He was clearly surprised by her offer, by her willingness to forgive him, by her unwavering belief in the possibility of change. When she was finished, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse, his eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and hope.
"Why?"
he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why would you do this? After everything I've done?" "Because I believe in you, Don Carlo," Serafina said, her voice firm. "I believe that everyone deserves a second chance. I believe that we can learn from our mistakes, that we can change, that we can build a better future together." He stared at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. He saw not weakness, not naivete, but strength, compassion, and an unwavering belief in the power of redemption. He slowly nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "I accept," he said. "I accept your offer." It was a moment of profound significance, a turning point in the history of the two families. The ghosts of yesterday, the decades of violence and betrayal, were finally laid to rest. Serafina's gamble had paid off. Her faith in humanity, her courage to forgive, had broken the cycle of revenge and opened the door to a new era of peace and cooperation. But could this truly be the end of the conflict, or was it merely a lull before another storm? Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and loyalties. Don Carlo's acceptance of Serafina's offer, while seemingly sincere, was met with skepticism by many within the Mancini family, including Luca. He remained wary of the former rival, convinced that it was a ploy, a tactic to buy time and regroup. Serafina, however, held firm in her belief that Don Carlo was genuine, that he had finally seen the error of his ways. To solidify the newfound alliance and demonstrate her trust, Serafina decided to proceed with her wedding to Luca, inviting Don Carlo and his family as a gesture of reconciliation. It was a bold move, a public display of unity that she hoped would quell any lingering doubts and solidify the peace. The wedding was a lavish affair, held at the beautiful villa in the countryside. The guests, a mix of Mancini and Salieri family members, mingled cautiously, the atmosphere a blend of celebration and apprehension. Serafina, radiant in a white gown, and Luca, handsome in a dark suit, exchanged vows, their love a beacon of hope amidst the shadows of the past. Don Carlo, standing among the guests, watched the ceremony with a mixture of emotions. He saw in Serafina and Luca a future he had once craved, a future of love, of family, of peace. He saw the error of his ways, the futility of his ambition, the devastation he had caused. As Serafina and Luca were pronounced husband and wife, a sudden commotion erupted near the entrance of the villa. A group of armed men, their faces masked, stormed the grounds, firing their weapons into the air. Chaos ensued, the guests scattering in panic, the wedding celebration turning into a scene of terror. Luca, instinctively moving to protect Serafina, drew his own weapon, ready to defend his bride, his family. But before he could fire a shot, Don Carlos stepped in front of him, shielding him from the attackers.
Go.
Don Carlos shouted, his voice firm. Protect Serafina. I'll handle this. He then turned to face the attackers, his own weapon drawn. He recognized them. They were members of a rogue faction within his own family, loyalists who had refused to accept his surrender, who had plotted to assassinate Serafina and Luca, to seize control of both families. A fierce gunfight erupted, the air filled with the sounds of gunfire, screams, and shattering glass. Don Carlo, despite his age, fought with the ferocity and skill of a seasoned warrior, defending Serafina and Luca, the very people he had once sought to destroy. He managed to take down several of the attackers, but he was outnumbered, outgunned. He was shot multiple times, his body riddled with bullets. He fell to the ground, his lifeblood staining the pristine white tiles of the villa. Serafina, witnessing Don Carlo's sacrifice, screamed in horror. Luca, torn between protecting his wife and helping Don Carlo, hesitated for a moment, then rushed to Don Carlo's side, firing at the remaining attackers. The guards, alerted by the gunfire, finally arrived, engaging the attackers and driving them away. The chaos subsided, leaving behind a scene of carnage and devastation. Serafina knelt beside Don Carlo, her hands trembling as she tried to staunch the bleeding from his wounds. He was fading fast, his breathing shallow and labored.
Why?
Serafina asked, her voice choked with tears. Why did you do it? Don Carlo looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and peace. Because you were right, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There is another way, a better way. He then closed his eyes, his body going limp. He was gone. Don Carlo's sacrifice, his final act of redemption, had saved Serafina and Luca's lives. He had proven that even the most hardened heart could change, that forgiveness and reconciliation were possible. His death, while tragic, solidified the peace between the two families. The rogue faction, their leader gone, their plot foiled, were quickly rounded up and dealt with. The remaining members of the Salieri family, witnessing Don Carlo's ultimate sacrifice, swore their allegiance to Serafina and Luca, vowing to honor the peace. The final confrontation was not merely of bullets, but of deeply rooted beliefs, of loyalty to oneself and others. The wedding, stained with tragedy, became a symbol of sacrifice and new beginnings. Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to Serafina's vision, her leadership, and her unwavering belief in the possibility of change. The Mancini and Salieri families, once bitter rivals, became allies, partners, working together to build a new legacy, a legacy based not on fear and violence, but on trust and cooperation. Serafina, with Luca by her side, continued to reform the family, moving away from the traditional reliance on illegal activities, focusing on legitimate businesses, investing in the community, creating opportunities for those who had been marginalized and disenfranchised. She established a foundation in Don Carlo's name, a foundation dedicated to helping young people escape the cycle of violence, to providing them with education, job training, a chance at a better life. She honored his sacrifice, his final act of redemption, by working to create a world where such sacrifices were no longer necessary. She and Luca, their love deepened by the trials they had faced, built a family of their own, raising their children in a world far removed from the shadows of their past. They taught them the values of compassion, forgiveness, and the importance of fighting for what is right, even when it is difficult. The villa, once a symbol of power and intrigue, became a home, filled with laughter, love, and the warmth of family. The ghosts of yesterday were finally laid to rest, replaced by the promise of a brighter future. Serafina, looking back on her journey, from the grieving widow to the powerful capo, from the pawn in a dangerous game to the architect of a new era, realized that she had not only transformed the family, she had transformed herself. She had discovered her strength, her resilience, her capacity for love and forgiveness. She often thought of Antonio, of his legacy, of the choices he had made. She understood now that he had been trapped, just like her, by the expectations of his family, by the weight of tradition. But she had broken free. She had forged her own path. She had created a different kind of legacy. One evening, as she and Lucas sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, she turned to him, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "We did it, Luca," she said, her voice soft. "We built a new world." He smiled, a slow, tender smile that reached his eyes. "We did," he agreed. "Together." He leaned in, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that was both passionate and gentle, a kiss that sealed their bond, a kiss that spoke of a love that had endured, a love that had conquered all. The city below them twinkled with lights, a vibrant testament to the peace they had forged. The long journey had reached its end, a testament to love, courage, and the enduring power of forgiveness. The end.